Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do so much appreciate you being with me. Hey, listen, share the news of this program. I hear from so many of you expressing your gratitude for what I'm sharing with you, for the liberating nature of fulfilled eschatology, the invigorating nature of the preterist view. That's wonderful, and I appreciate that so very, very much. It's so encouraging to me to hear from you. And so please share the word. Let people know about the good news that God has kept his word. All right? We don't have to worry that Jesus failed his own challenge. All right? So share the word, pass the word, and let's keep bumping up that number of subscriptions. Now then, we are looking at the Olivet Discourse, continuing our study. We are focused on Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, where Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in his glory, or shall come with the angels, and shall sit on the throne of his glory, and all nations shall be gathered before him. Well, this is one of those key passages that futurists appeal to say, well, see, it hasn't happened. Now, we have a choice here, ladies and gentlemen, as I've shared with you many, many times. Jesus gave a challenge. And don't forget, my Now TV television program every Friday morning at 9:30 Central Time, and you can tune in. And I've been discussing the challenge of Christ for 2 years. And the challenge of Christ is quite powerful, and it's quite clear, and it's quite undeniable. Jesus said, John chapter 10, 37 and following, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Now, yesterday I shared with you that Jesus said he was going to come back with the angels in glory, in the judgment of every man, before all of the audience, a huge audience, that was standing there listening to him before they all passed away. The challenge of Christ is clear, ladies and gentlemen. If Jesus did not come back in that generation, before all of those people died, then he failed his own challenge. If he failed his own challenge, he is not the Son of Man. There is no conditionality to his promise of coming back in that generation. No conditionality to it. He didn't say, now, if enough of you will believe, I'll come back. And he did not say, and if you don't believe me, I won't come back. That's really, honestly, a contrived, invented theological doctrine in order to justify the failure of Jesus' own challenge. Okay, so we looked yesterday at the parallels between Matthew 16, 27 and 28 and Matthew 25, 31 and 32. I want to go back a little bit before that now to a passage that, granted, does not contain every single constituent element of Matthew 25, 31 and following, but that raises a very important hermeneutical question that I'll address momentarily. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sent his apostles out, and he told them to not go into the way of the Gentiles, but to go only to the cities of Israel. But he said, you're going to be hated by all men for my name's sake. And they will persecute you. They will bring you before synagogues, before councils, Sanhedrins. And he said, in speaking about that persecution, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel. Now, some people say, well, we have a problem here. He sends them out to preach, but then he says, you won't even have finished your job of preaching before I come. No, no, no. That's not correct. He is sending them out to preach, that's to be sure, but he is talking about them fleeing from city to city and says, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. So it is their flight from persecution through the cities of Israel which delimits it to the lifetime of the apostles. Now, let me make something abundantly clear, and textual scholars have struggled with this for centuries. When the apostles sent when Jesus sent the apostles out in what we call the limited commission, they were not persecuted. So it is widely believed that that Matthew transposes Jesus' discussion of persecution of the apostles and flight from persecution from the context of Matthew chapter 24, and he has transposed it to Matthew chapter 10. I don't have the answer for that. I know that there was no persecution in what we call the limited commission. Okay? It's a difficult question, one for which I do not have an easy at-hand explanation. But once again, I know that they were not persecuted in the limited commission. I know they were persecuted in the Great Commission. And so, we have to struggle with that. We really do. But here's the point. Speaking to his 12 apostles, he sent them to preach. He said, you will be persecuted. And again, didn't happen during the limited commission. You will not have fled through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have the coming of the Son of Man here. Well, that cannot be, once again, that cannot be the ascension. Jesus did not send his apostles out on a preaching mission for which they were persecuted prior to the ascension. We know this. This is undeniable. So the coming of the Son of Man of Matthew chapter 10, 22 and 23 has to be a coming of the Son of Man at the time of and in vindication of the suffering of his apostles as they go and as they preach and as they're persecuted. But again, this had to be in the lifetime of the apostles. And some people say, oh, well, Jesus was speaking generically here when he said you. He's speaking of his followers. Whenever this might be. Ladies and gentlemen, number one, if you make this an evangelistic reference, saying, in other words, you will not have preached through all the cities of Israel before I have come. Guess what? The gospel was preached throughout all the land of Israel in the first century. Romans 10, 18 to 21, Romans chapter 1, 8 through 10, Colossians chapter 1, 5 to 7, Colossians 1, 23. The gospel had been preached in all the world. I'm assuming that since Paul said the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven, that included the land of Israel. Okay? So you can't make Matthew chapter 10 a prediction about the preaching of the gospel to the land of Israel and say, well, it had never been done in the first century. Yes, it was done in the first century. You cannot exclude the apostles from Jesus' promise. And it was the apostles that preached the gospel into all the world in the first century. Once again, this coming of the Lord in Matthew chapter 10, 22 and 23 is the coming of the Son of Man. Now, remember, this is the coming of the Son of Man in vindication of the suffering of his apostles who went and preached and were persecuted for going and preaching. This brings up this hermeneutical issue. I have had people say, incredibly, and it gets back to what I mentioned yesterday. It is absolutely astounding at times what the arguments, if you can even classify them, qualify them, dignify them as arguments of what people will say to maintain their futurist view. I've had people say, well, okay, there was a coming of the Son of Man in Matthew chapter 10, 22 and 23. Pardon me. But if you will notice, Matthew 10, 22 and 23 doesn't say one word about coming with the angels. It really doesn't mention verbatim. It doesn't mention coming in judgment. It doesn't mention the gathering of the nations. And it most assuredly does not mention the judgment of the nations. Therefore, Matthew 10, 22 and 23 must be different from Matthew 25, 31 and following. Well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, I call this the missing word hermeneutic. In my formal public debate with Dr. Joel McDermott in 2012, which, by the way, is available for download on my website, donkpreston.com, I drew out the parallels between Isaiah 24 through 27, pardon me, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The parallels are all there. Pardon me. The parallels are not only there, but Paul tells us that his resurrection doctrine of 1 Corinthians 15 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 25, verse 8. They're very clearly the same. And I had several charts up there. So when Dr. McDermott got up to offer his, quote, rebuttal, unquote, he says, well, you know, that was really a fine presentation, highly organized by Don. But he said, the problem is, I don't see the term final judge or final resurrection in Isaiah chapter 25. And I knew what he was going to say. I was still, you know, somewhat stunned that anyone would actually make that argument in a formal public debate. But I got up and I said, since Paul said that his resurrection doctrine, you know, the final resurrection doctrine of 1 Corinthians 15 would be when Isaiah 25 was fulfilled, it doesn't matter if you see the term final resurrection in Isaiah or not. 1 Corinthians 15 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 25. 1 Corinthians 15 is about the final resurrection. Therefore, Isaiah 25 is about the final resurrection. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when people start trying to find distinctions, create dichotomies and divisions based upon the use or non-use of a word or term or phrase here that is absent over here, that is a horrible, untenable hermeneutic. Let me illustrate very quickly, out of time. I don't know of any futurist that denies that Acts chapter 1 is the, quote, second coming of Christ. It's the end of time, end of the age coming of Christ at the time of the resurrection. Okay. In other words, it's the same coming of Christ of 1 Corinthians 15. Same coming of Christ of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Same coming of Christ of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and on it goes. And by the way, in my debate with Joel McDermott, I had charts illustrating this. Okay, so all futurists agree Acts 1 is 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, 2 Corinthians 5, etc. But wait a minute. Slow this train down. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about, quote, the time of the end, like 1 Corinthians 15 does. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about the earth and the elements that are therein being destroyed, as in 2 Peter chapter 3. And yet everyone says 2 Peter 3 is the same as Acts 1. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about all the nations being gathered before him. Not one word. Oh, and by the way, Acts chapter 1 says not one word about him even coming in judgment. So if you're going to offer the argument, well, you know, Matthew chapter 10, it doesn't talk about Christ coming with the angels in the judgment. Hey, it doesn't even say anything about the coming in the kingdom. Therefore, it must be different from Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Do you see how absurd that is? Argumentum ad desperatum. Argumentum ad absurdum. It is a false hermeneutic that is self-destructive. Okay, point being, Matthew chapter 10, persecution, the coming of the Son of Man, and vindication. Matthew chapter 16, 27 and 28, the coming of the Son of Man and vindication of his persecuted saints. We haven't developed that, but it's there. Matthew chapter 25, the coming of the Son of Man with his angels in the judgment. The great question is, where is the distinction? And the answer is, there is no distinction. I'm out of time. Go to my website. I mean, January offer is over, but please take advantage of the fantastic material available there. And by the way, we've got some incredible news coming in the very near future concerning all of my material on flash drives. You're going to love this. Going to be awesome. Anyway, I'll see you on the flip side.